So we saw previously that many countries in Europe were experiencing some significant recovery in the 1920s. Most notably, the way that the Weimar Republic was able to restore relationships with the rest of Europe, especially through the Locarno Pact. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was ultimately trying to make it so that war could never happen again. We saw France's economy recovering through Raymond Poincaré's um, economic measures by cutting government spending, raising taxes. We saw Britain emerging into a welfare state. It seems like things were going okay for Europe. Well, that was until around 1929 when a Great Depression struck Western Europe as well as the United States. So ultimately we need to figure out what causes this Great Depression, the different remedies that countries attempt to take to alleviate the symptoms of depression, and how ultimately the real way that these countries pull themselves out is by rearmament leading up to World War II. Okay, so overall causes. One of the most significant causes of the depression was overproduction. Right, and this was both agricultural and industrial. So ultimately what you were seeing during World War I in particular, realized that so much of the agricultural land, especially along the Western Front, was ultimately destroyed by trench warfare. Right? So the solution to that was to have countries like the United States and Canada ultimately supply food for these countries affected by the damage to the Western Front. So you had an increase in American agricultural production during the World War I era. After World War I ended, there was still a period where this land had not yet recovered, and again, these Western European countries had to rely on outside markets for agricultural products. However, when you get a little bit farther into the 20s, these agricultural economies in Western Europe are able to recover. The problem is that places like Canada and the United States are still producing at wartime levels. Now, what does this do to prices? Of course, if you're producing so much, then ultimately these things are going to be sold for much cheaper, and farmers are actually finding that they're not taking in as much money as they initially are spending in order to produce it. So farming actually is going to be hit much sooner than the general economy. Really, farmers were experiencing the symptoms of the Great Depression in the mid to late 1920s. It just wasn't until the stock market crashed that people realized how weak and vulnerable and in crisis the economy really was. We also see industrial overproduction, in particular the overproduction of automobiles. We found that they were being produced so much in places like Canada, in particular, that they were literally just sitting in lots, unable to be purchased. Ultimately, what we're finding is that by producing at this wartime level, it is going to make it so that prices are unable to ultimately be high enough in order to actually pay back the amount of money that it took to create the product. Workers are not going to be able to make enough money to actually afford the products that they created. Right? So again, if you're working in the automobile industry, you do not have enough money to be able to afford the car that you produced, even though there's a crazy amount of cars that are available because they were produced so rapidly. So overproduction is a huge problem. You're also just going to find in general the international economy is very weak. It is certainly going to continue to be that way, especially when we see the introduction of tariffs in order to try to combat some of the earliest symptoms of depression. We also have some significant problems with banking. Banking's issued really easy credit during the 1920s and prior. So basically there was no real restriction as to who could take out loans from banks. They were often, for lack of a better word, sort of promiscuous in the ways in which they would issue loans to people. Oftentimes these loans would be spent on things like over speculation of land, buying a ton of land and trying to sell it at a profit. But ultimately, when that land no longer was increasing in price, this scheme no longer worked. You're going to see that eventually, because banks issue so many loans and so much credit, that when they try to recall these loans when the depression hits, that this money literally isn't going to be available anymore. Okay, so again, the stock market crash, unlike a lot of people argue that a lot of people kind of think of the stock market crash as a cause of the Great Depression. Arguably, it's much more of an effect or much more of a symptom of the Great Depression. Um, so what you're going to see is that the stock market crash, in a way, maybe triggered the Great Depression that spread worldwide because it was this very tangible indicator of what was so wrong with the economy. But at the same time, like I was saying earlier, it was in the 1920s already with overproduction that the symptoms of the Depression had already started. So again, what caused the stock market crash? One of the huge problems was over speculating. Basically, ultimately, um, biting off way more than you can chew, I suppose you could say, in terms of spending. Oftentimes over speculating applied to the purchase of land. People would buy great amounts of land and try to sell them to another buyer for a profit. But ultimately, if the price of land did not go up, over speculation would end up failing, and people would not ultimately be able to make back the money that they borrowed to buy this land. You also saw that the stock market became increasingly trendy, and people actually were buying stocks without their own money. They were borrowing money to buy stocks, which again is very devastating. When the stock market crashes and there's a recall, you don't actually have that money available when the stocks need to be sold, right? Or actually, also, when the stock price drops significantly, you're you are actually not only going to lose whatever value in the stocks, but you're also still going to have to pay back whoever you borrowed the money from, and that money is just not going to be there because the price sank so low when the stock market dropped. Again, this has to do with easy credit offered from banks and other loaners. Also, there was this phenomenon called buying stocks on margin. That meant you only had to pay for a percentage of the price of the actual stock. So for example, if you were buying $100 worth of stock, you may have only had to pay $10 in order to actually own that stock. But again, if that price fell, you would still have to pay back the entire value of it, right? So again, you buy $100 worth of stock with $10, but then suddenly the price of the stock shrinks to $50, you still are going to owe $100 on that stock, even though it's worth less than what you originally bought it for. Okay, so how do certain countries kind of respond to the early symptoms of the stock market crash and the Great Depression, and to what extent do they work? 1931, Britain and then 20 other countries decided to go off the gold standard. So again, under the gold standard, there's a certain amount of gold that actually backs your currency value. Britain, followed by 20 other countries, including the United States, decided to go off this to have a little bit more control over the value of their currency, and also to respond to the fact that there were not enough gold reserves in many of these countries. This does work to a certain extent. It does give a little bit more stability to the value of the currency, but again, it does not do enough. All right, the Hawley-Smoot tariff, a much less successful attempt at recovery. All right, the Hawley-Smoot tariff was a tariff that was enacted by the United States, and its attempt was to, again, keep trade at a domestic level, right? Basically prohibit the import of goods from other countries because they would be too expensive. The problem was that all countries wanted to do this, right? All countries wanted to make it so that their own internal economies would recover. They wanted to minimize imports. So basically, the Hawley-Smoot tariff launches off a series of reactionary or retaliation tariffs from 23 other countries, resulting in so-called tariff wars, which make it that much more difficult to have any sort of international trade system. All right? So you're also going to see that as the Depression sinks in, many bankers are going to start to recall loans. It's going to happen in New York. Bankers are going to recall loans made to Germany, for example. Remember the Dawes Act, right? Or the Dawes Plan, that is, attempting to loan money to Germany so they could pay their reparations. Other European countries also are going to get their loans recalled, and this is going to make Europeans' economic crisis that much worse. They are unable to pay back these American banks. All right. Also, people are going to rapidly try to sell goods that they own, because they're going to do anything they can to ultimately have some sort of supply of funds. But when people rapidly try to sell whatever product is, the prices are going to fall significantly. So, basically this is going to happen in Europe more than in the United States, because European businessmen are really going to be trying to rapidly sell goods to pay debts back to the U.S. And because of this, prices are going to fall dramatically, making the economy that much worse. As the European public panics, people are also going to rapidly withdraw funds from the banks, and banks are going to start collapsing. Okay, so what happens to Europe? Already we talked about the age of anxiety in the 20s. This is going to kind of reemerge, right? All the optimism that we experienced in the mid to late 20s with the recovery of the Weimar Republic, the recovery of the French economy, the way in which England is establishing more of a welfare state. All this sense of optimism in the late 1920s is going to shatter. You're going to see production decrease significantly, with the exception of Russia, because Russia has a communist command economy. So actually this is going to show certain capitalistic countries maybe that communism was more resilient to the kind of crisis that Western Europe and the United States was experiencing. You're going to have severe unemployment. Germany and the U.S. are going to have the biggest numbers: 43% unemployment in Germany, 25% in the United States, and then 18% in Britain. You're also going to have significant social effects, all right? Declining birth rates. People are postponing their marriages. People are having, again, less children if they have any, maybe one child in a family. You're going to have other social problems like the emergence of mental illness, suicide. Basically, the idea that you're starting to see is that it's sort of like both the economy and society are suffering from a kind of clinical depression. The economy, that sort of panic that it experienced in the late 1920s, is making it so that there's a virtually stagnant activity in the 1930s. It's like clinical depression in the sense that the economy is unwilling to actually rouse itself, like when a person can't get out of bed in the morning when they're suffering from depression. All right, attempted remedies. I'm going to save this for another video just so that everything fits into one, and then we will finish up with the Great Depression and this chapter.